So on here, we are going to create two different spheres and attempt to shade them. So you want something that's circular shaped unless you can freehand it or if you have a compass that will help you. So I'm going to use the inside of this tape to trace some circles on the top and the bottom. You can also work vertically if you would like to, but this is probably the easier way. So I'm going to go lightly with a pencil on the inside of here, trace that. Lightly on the inside of here, trace that. And mine are kind of off center because I'm going to fit a shadow. If you're left-handed and want to do the shadow the other way, then you can move those over if you like. Put them more in the middle. That's fine. I pre-draw everything with my pencil first and then I lighten that out. So I also want to do a background, so cutting somewhere into my circle. I'm going to use my ruler nice and straight to create those backgrounds. And then you can choose whether or not you want to draw in your shadow. So remember that a shadow is going to go opposite of the light source. So if my light's coming from here, my shadow will go that way. A lot of people have been misplacing those. So remember that it's an oval. You have to touch the very bottom. So the shadow is where the object touches the ground. So my shadow at least has to start somewhere in here and then can tilt. Lately we've been doing shadows that go kind of downwards. If the light is coming from in the front, it's actually going to go backwards. So today I'm going to do a shadow that tilts upwards and out like that. So I'll do that to both sides. So I'll also have my shadow coming from here, and that will be an oval that casts backwards. Part of it's going to get blocked off though. So I'll take my eraser and I'm going to lighten out my lines. Watercolor is fairly see-through, so if you have dark lines, you're also going to see those once the watercolor is on there, unlike other types of paint. So you really want to lighten those out now. We're going to do two different color schemes. So if you have room, you can label it. Mine's just going to be on the tape and eventually it'll go away. But at the top, we're going to do what's called an achromatic or a monochromatic color scheme. So achromatic, as we learned, is achroma. That means without chroma or without color, without that saturation. So there's going to be a black and white one. Or we can choose one color, so mono for one, and we'll choose one color to do here. I'll show you today an achromatic one, and if you'd rather do it with a color, then that's fine. At the bottom here, we are going to choose to do either a complementary color scheme or an analogous one. So complements or complementary or analogous, which means colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. So you can refer to the color wheel that you did before if you don't remember what colors are near each other on the rainbow. And we've already done some complement stuff, so I will show you an analogous one here. Now we're ready to start painting, so make sure you have your supplies with you. So your watercolors, your paint. You also want to get a paper towel or several, and then a water cup or two. And so I'm going to start with my first set, and you can really choose to do any area that you like to begin with. I'm going to do the sphere. Now, the issue with using watercolor is that I'm going to have to wait for an area to dry when I'm painting before I move on to another area. So you'll see that as we go along. Today I'm going to be using my black to create an achromatic version of this sphere. So just like before, if you need to turn in your sketchbook and look at an old picture of a sphere that's been shaded, then go for it. But in my ball, I really want some nice kind of blurry, smooth transitions. So if you remember when we were working on our techniques, when we made our gradient, it involves quite a bit of water that we use. So some people will do this dry, some people do this wet, but what you can do is kind of trace around the sphere that you're going to make with water. Not too much, just enough to kind of hydrate it, let it soak in there. And really be careful with your edges, so your paint will really fill in any areas that are wet. So now my sphere is wet. Now when I paint in here, if you remember, if I drop paint or if I put paint inside of an area that's wet, it gets very blurry. So that's actually going to help me today. I can paint directly with my black, but I also want to create some nice grays. So I'm gonna make a decent pile of water up at the top of my tray in my palette. Ooh, there's a little pink in there, I don't want that. Move that over. And I'll take a little bit of the black and put that in. So it looks fairly dark on the screen, but it's not honestly that dark. For this, you can grab a scrap piece of paper, so one of your old assignments if you want to, and just paint it down. You can see that's fairly light. So with this, I'm essentially going to put in my midtones. So I know over here, towards the bottom, I want this to be fairly gray, and I want that to come up and around. And I'm gonna use the water to kind of lighten and blur certain areas. So now I have a fairly light kind of gray. I'm going to keep going over where I think it'll be darkest in layers. And if I need to make my paint darker, then I will do that. If it's like really, really soaking wet, then my paint will kind of spread all over the place, kind of crazily. So I'm going to build this slowly. If you do this while the paint is dry or while the ball is dry, you can still get this kind of blurring effect as long as you go over the edges with more water. So either technique is going to work. So I'll slowly build more and more value wherever I think it's the darkest and kind of help blur the edges. So I'm not really adding more water to this, just more paint. As it dries, I should be able to control it. I'm gonna get fairly dark right around there. Again, if it gets kind of caught like that, I'm gonna go in with my brush and fix it. Now, let's say that, remember I want that area to be nice and bright and highlighted, but sometimes when we have too much water, we end up with a singular kind of blob. If you end up with a singular blob or the highlight's not in the right place or it's all running together, remember that you can pick stuff up with your brush or with your paper towel. So I really want my highlight here. So while it's still wet, I'm going to go kind of readdress that area, dry it out with my paper towel. Go back in with a clean brush. So here's my water, I cleaned out my brush. It's not too wet, but it has a little bit of moisture on it. And then I'll go in with the water to kind of help blur that out. You want to be careful that you're not super scratching at your paper, so don't brush so hard. But I want to add in water and let that brighten. We don't really add masking tape anywhere that we want it to transition into white, only in areas that we want to slowly become white. Or that we, want to be really hard edged. So there we go. Like I said, I'm going to get fairly dark at some point and try to address all those areas in between so we get nice midtones. As I said, I'm doing this fairly wet and all kind of in one. let's talk about the dry way that you can do this as well. So on this one, I pre-soaked the sphere. If I wanted to do this another way, I could go in and just paint, kind of with a gray, like this, figure out what areas I want it to be mostly shaded, and avoid the area that I want to be white. So this is all dry, and I'm painting down gray. Then I take a little bit of water, and I go right in between that area that's white and that area that's gray. I'll try to scrub that so that it looks like it's transitioning a little bit better. Once I have that, I can let this dry and just go over layers and layers and layers to make it slowly darker. So wait for this to dry later. I'll leave this alone, and then I'll move on to another part, wait for it to dry, and then go on again. So whichever technique you think will work for you the best. Right now that's kind of running and my paper is folding a little bit. So I want to pick up some of that with my brush. I know that a lot of us have white and we might be tempted to use it, but as I said, we want to pretend this doesn't exist. And I'm going to really sharpen out those areas. So the problem with watercolor, one of the issues is that I can't really paint anything else right now because this is wet, and if I try to paint any other area, it's probably going to bleed into there while this is still wet. So what I can do is I can wait, take a blow dryer to it if I want to make that process faster, and then I can go in and I can address the other areas. So that's why we're working on two paintings at the same time. So now that this is like in the middle of drying, I'm gonna go down here. So today I'm gonna do either a complementary or an analogous color scheme. I'm gonna do an analogous one, which means colors next to each other. Usually if your paints are organized, you have colors that are already next to each other like pretty well. So if you remember our color wheel, we have yellow, which is close to green, goes yellow, yellow, green, green, blue. So I can use these kind of colors. So if you think yellow to blue and in between there is green, then that should be fine. So I'm going to paint this kind of slowly. I know that this time I want my highlight to be a bright color, so I want that to be kind of yellow. And then it's going to transition into green. So I'm gonna kind of paint my highlight first, and then mix myself a nice yellow-green on the side here. And that's, again, while I'm waiting for that one to dry. So have a nice yellow-green. I'm going to add that onto there. Try to blend those together. I think I can add more yellow in here. Slowly making this darker as I go on. So I'm kind of going in like ring formations. Let's get darker right where we think our core shadow should be. And so for that, I'm gonna go pretty dark green. And right now that's not blending very well, so I want to help it along by taking my brush, kind of painting in between there to help it along. Remember at the bottom we have a reflected light, so we need to go down into there and paint that. And right now, a lot of our paints are very watery. So it's entirely possible that while this dries, you'll decide you want to go over it again later. I can brighten that area up. Really go over with another layer if you want to. Yay. Okay. So now that I've done this, you can see in this area, this is starting to get a little bit lighter. Watercolor tends to dry just a little bit lighter than you're expecting. So be aware of that. I can move on to two different areas. So these two areas aren't touching each other, the shadow and the background. So I can work with both of those. I'm going to start with my background real quick. So what I like to do is go very specifically around the actual sphere itself. Let me move water cup. Like that. And there. You can also pre-soak it. You just want to make sure that you're actually going around with your water. And now I can kind of spread this out a little bit better. So you can definitely do a gradient with this if you want to. You can make it pretty even. But what's important is that you have that really hard line between the actual sphere and the background. So go over that. You can see I can like pre-soak if you want to. You can also use the flat brush, but it is a little bit harder to control in those small little angles. And then you can go in with your paint. This is also a fun time if you liked any of those techniques that we did. If you want to experiment with using them to make your background more interesting, then you can definitely do that. So there's my background. I'm going to go down at the bottom now and get my core shadow. So core shadow is like as dark as it absolutely can be, right under where that touches. And then it's going to go out. So I'm doing this kind of dry. And you can see that it's super black. So when we do our gradients, remember to start really dark. And then you'll wash off your brush a little bit, not too much. And then before it dries, you want to catch the edge and bring that outwards. So if you wanted a kind of blurrier like shadow, you can do that also if you decide that you want to paint the background first on the ground. Then you can definitely make for some very blurry edges as well. So if I don't want this to be a hard one, then I'll take some more water and kind of expand that out. Kind of like creating very small gradients on the side. And you're gonna let that fade away. Now that's optional, and you can absolutely just do a regular hard line shadow if you want to. But some shadows are going to be blurry. So under there, just kind of help that out. So if you can like super avoid that line that I made. See what happens if I like touch it is that it'll start to bleed down. So that's why we're not quite doing that yet. So just take that, clean that out. And instead I can move on to other areas that I want to address. So over here I think this can be a little bit darker. It's not technically touching the shadow that I did as long as I just go in here. So you see that I have kind of a dark area. I'll do that same thing where I take that and I will blur the edges slightly to create some darker shadows. You can keep the background nice and like white if you want to. It's up to you. I mostly use the small brush, but if there's areas that you want to kind of brush over bigger, then you can take your larger brush and kind of sweep over them as well. So once it's all dry, you can take your clean water and do that. So you still have a fairly light bottom. You can also, if you prefer to, make your background slightly colored, so you can make this all a pretty light gray, and that will also work. Okay, so let's move on to the bottom one. Now that this is dry, I can add more shadows. I can do the same thing where I go into the background. So background for this one, I'm going to make slightly blue. So we have yellow, green. We can do kind of a bluer green up here. And actually, let me show you. I can just take my water again, just like I did at the top, and kind of carefully go around. Oops. Let's get rid of that real quick. So I can carefully go over and around any of those areas that I would like to first. So kind of pre-soak them. A large brush will help me in this kind of bigger areas, but the small one for those kind of tiny ones. Take my color and put that down. Now we don't want to do the thing where we avoid the actual sphere itself, so be very careful about going around it. Put some nice colors in there. You can always keep going in layers to make that more intense. So there's that. Then we're gonna do the shadow at the bottom. Same thing that I said before. We wanna make sure that the bottom is like as dark as it can get, right where you imagine that it touches. And then you wanna bring that out. And I can transition into a different color. Okay, so I'm going to make sure that this time I have a kind of sharper edge to my shadow. It can go either way, so it can be blurry like up top, or you can be a little bit sharper, which is probably a little easier for a beginner to control. As long as the surface isn't wet, then you should get these sharp lines. Just make sure that it's the darkest right under where the sphere would touch the ground. And then extend that and fade that outwards. And there's that. I will wait for this to dry and then probably go over this with some more color. My monochromatic one looks pretty nice. There is a way to kind of like cheat and make everything gray first, but I think this looks pretty nice itself. So at this point I'll speed through just kind of blending in some shadows and really making things darker. Remember that when we work with watercolors, we have to layer on to get as dark as we can. We can't just mix a color, paint it down, and think it'll be done, but when it dries it tends to be a little bit lighter. So I'm going back and forth, creating kind of darker layers. Sometimes I'll work at the top and sometimes I'll work at the bottom. So you really have to kind of multitask when you are doing watercolor. So I can darken the background. I'm probably going to also need to darken some other areas like the shadows, like the core shadow. I also want a little bit darker. And that applies to both of my paintings. So go back and forth with these layers, wait for things to dry in between, and blend anything that needs to have kind of softer gradients until you get a look that you think is good. So here I've waited a while for this to dry, and I'm going to again go back in with more layers where I want it to be extra dark in the core shadow and the cast shadow. Make sure that there's enough contrast. At the bottom I'm going to add an entire layer of yellow, and that's going to make my paintings stand out from the background a lot more. While that's drying, again go back and forth and really address the top area. Again, I don't really want super white areas here because I want my paper to look distinct when I eventually take the tape off. And at the bottom I'm doing the same thing, so adding core shadows, cast shadows until it looks like a finished painting. So go in as many layers as you want to really make this stand out. It requires a lot of patience. The last step, if you put tape around here, then you're going to remove it. You want to be careful that you lift it up at like a 90-degree angle to avoid some tearing. And that's it.